In the winter of 1945, Soviet soldiers fighting their way through Eastern Europe toward Berlin had been thoroughly indoctrinated about what awaited them if they were captured by Western forces. Political commissars attached to every Soviet military unit conducted regular sessions emphasizing that capture by Americans or British meant torture, starvation, and eventual execution. The capitalist armies, Soviet soldiers were told, had no respect for human life and treated prisoners worse than animals. Commissars showed propaganda materials depicting American and British soldiers as monsters who delighted in cruelty. Soviet troops were instructed that if capture seemed inevitable, they should save their last bullet for themselves rather than endure the horrors of capitalist captivity. Death in battle was honorable. Surrender was not just cowardly, but suicidal. This messaging was reinforced constantly through political education, through conversations with officers, through the entire structure of Soviet military culture. The source of this propaganda was partly ideological and partly practical. Soviet communist ideology portrayed capitalist nations as inherently cruel and exploitative, systems where human beings were valued only for their labor and discarded when no longer useful. This ideological framework made it easy for Soviet leadership to claim that American and British treatment of prisoners would be barbaric. But there was also a practical reason for the propaganda. Stalin and Soviet leadership needed to prevent Soviet soldiers from surrendering. They needed men who would fight to the death rather than allow themselves to be captured. The Soviet military operated on principles of absolute commitment, where retreat without orders was treason and surrender was betrayal. If Soviet soldiers believed capture by Western forces meant reasonable treatment and survival, they might choose surrender over death when situations became hopeless. Soviet leadership couldn't allow that. So they lied systematically and thoroughly about what American captivity would mean. Soviet soldiers had some basis for believing these lies because they had direct experience with German treatment of Soviet prisoners. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, beginning in June 1941, had resulted in millions of Soviet soldiers being captured in the early months of the war. German treatment of Soviet POWs was genocidal. Nazi racial ideology classified Slavic peoples as subhuman, and Soviet prisoners were treated accordingly. They were starved and worked to death, executed casually, and left to die in camps where conditions were deliberately designed to kill. Of approximately 5.5 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, over 3 million died in captivity. The survivors endured horrors that those who hadn't experienced them could barely imagine. Soviet soldiers who had been in German captivity and later returned to Soviet lines, or who had heard accounts from those who had, knew that capture could mean death through deliberate cruelty. When Soviet commissars claimed that American and British forces would treat Soviet prisoners the same way Germans had, Soviet soldiers had a frame of reference that made the claims believable. What Soviet soldiers didn't know was that Western Allied forces operated under completely different principles regarding prisoners of war. The United States and Britain were signatories to the Geneva Convention, which established international standards for treatment of POWs. These standards required that prisoners be housed, fed, and treated humanely, that they receive medical care for injuries and illnesses, that they be protected from violence and abuse, and that they be allowed communication with families through Red Cross channels. American and British military culture emphasized that honorable soldiers treated prisoners decently because that was both morally right and strategically wise. Treating prisoners well encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, saving lives on both sides. It also ensured that your own soldiers, if captured, would be more likely to receive decent treatment under principles of reciprocity. These practical and moral reasons combined to create Allied POW policies that were vastly different from German treatment of Soviet prisoners or Soviet treatment of German prisoners. By late 1944 and early 1945, as American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet forces advanced from the east, Western Allied forces began encountering and capturing Soviet soldiers in various circumstances. Some were Soviet POWs who had been held in German camps and were liberated when American or British forces overran those camps. Others were Soviet soldiers who had been pressed into German service, either voluntarily after capture or through various forms of coercion. and who were captured when the units they served with surrendered to Western forces. Still others were Soviet soldiers who found themselves behind American or British lines through the chaos of the war's final months and who were taken into custody. All of these Soviet citizens, regardless of how they came to be in Western custody, shared the same terror based on what they had been told about American and British treatment of prisoners. The first encounters between terrified Soviet soldiers and American forces often began with confusion on both sides. American soldiers, encountering men in German uniforms who spoke Russian or other Slavic languages, initially didn't know what to make of them. Were these Russians fighting for Germany? Were they prisoners being forced to fight? The Soviet soldiers, expecting immediate execution or torture, were shocked when American soldiers offered them cigarettes, gave them water, and treated their wounds. One Soviet soldier captured in Germany in February 1945 later recounted that when American soldiers approached him after his unit surrendered, he closed his eyes and waited to be shot. Instead, an American soldier helped him to his feet, brushed dirt off his uniform, and offered him a chocolate bar. The Soviet soldier thought he was hallucinating. Americans weren't supposed to have chocolate to spare, and they certainly weren't supposed to share it with prisoners. The cognitive dissonance between what he had been taught and what he was experiencing was so severe that he assumed he was dying, and this was some kind of dying dream. American field commanders dealing with Soviet prisoners faced logistical and political complications, but operated under clear doctrinal guidance about prisoner treatment. Soviet soldiers in American custody would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, which meant housing them in camps, feeding them adequately, providing medical care, and processing them through established POW procedures. The logistical challenge was that by early 1945, American forces were handling enormous numbers of German prisoners as Germany's military collapsed, and adding Soviet prisoners to this population created additional strain on resources. But the policy was clear. Prisoners would be treated humanely regardless of their nationality or how they came to be captured. American mess sergeants received orders to feed Soviet POWs from the same kitchens that fed American troops, using the same rations and in similar quantities. American medical officers treated Soviet POW injuries and illnesses the same way they treated American casualties, with the same medicines and procedures. This equality of treatment was deliberate policy, reflecting American values about human dignity and the proper conduct of war. The Soviet prisoners' first experience of American field kitchens serving hot meals created reactions that American soldiers found bewildering until they understood the context. Soviet POWs would receive their meals, stare at the plates laden with food, and refuse to eat. Some cried. Others carefully hid portions of food in their clothing, hoarding it against future starvation they assumed was coming. Still others ate ravenously, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. American soldiers serving in mess lines couldn't understand these reactions until interpreters explained that Soviet prisoners thought the food was too good to be real, that this must be a propaganda display or a temporary measure before the real starvation began. Soviet POWs literally couldn't believe that American forces would feed prisoners the same rations American soldiers ate. In Soviet military experience, prisoners were fed minimal rations of the worst available food, just barely enough to keep them alive for labor. The idea that captors would give prisoners good food in adequate quantities every single day seemed impossible. One American sergeant running a mess hall at a POW processing center in Germany in March 1945 kept a diary where he recorded his interactions with Soviet prisoners. He wrote about a Soviet POW who received his dinner, a meal of beef stew, bread, canned fruit, and coffee, and who stood holding the plate while tears ran down his face. Through an interpreter, the Soviet prisoner explained that he had been a soldier for 4 years and had never eaten as well as this, that Soviet military rations had been inadequate and irregular, that he had been hungry essentially his entire time in service. The sergeant wrote that the Soviet prisoner asked if this was the last meal before execution, if Americans fed prisoners well before killing them to show mercy. When told that he would receive 3 meals like this every day, as long as he remained in American custody, the Soviet prisoner didn't believe it. He thought the interpreter was lying to make him feel better before the inevitable execution. Only after several days of regular meals did this particular prisoner begin to accept that American treatment of POWs was genuinely different from what he had experienced and expected. American military doctors treating Soviet prisoners found similar patterns of disbelief and confusion. Soviet POWs with serious wounds or illnesses would resist medical treatment, apparently expecting that medical care was a prelude to execution or human experimentation. When American doctors used anesthesia for surgery, administered antibiotics for infections, and provided post-operative care, Soviet patients responded with shock and gratitude, but also with suspicion. Why would the Americans waste valuable medicines on prisoners? What did they want in return? Some Soviet POWs assumed that Americans expected them to provide intelligence or to betray their country in exchange for medical care. American medical personnel had to work through interpreters to explain that medical treatment was provided because wounded and sick people deserved care regardless of their status as prisoners, that American medical ethics required treating all patients to the best of available ability. This concept, that enemies deserved the same medical care as friends, was so foreign to Soviet experience that many prisoners struggled to accept it, even after receiving treatment. The contrast between American treatment of Soviet POWs and Soviet treatment of prisoners became starkly clear when Soviet prisoners who had been held in German camps and then liberated by American forces began describing their experiences. These men had survived German captivity where conditions were designed to kill, where starvation, disease, exposure, and casual violence were daily realities. They had lived through situations where German guards would shoot prisoners for entertainment, where medical care was non-existent, where the weak were left to die without assistance. When American forces liberated German POW camps holding Soviet prisoners, American soldiers were horrified by what they found. The Soviet POWs were skeletal, diseased, traumatized beyond anything American liberators had encountered, even in German concentration camps. American military doctors and medics immediately began treating these Soviet former prisoners, providing emergency medical care, food carefully calibrated to avoid refeeding syndrome in starving people, and psychiatric support for men who had been broken by their experiences. The Soviet POWs rescued from German camps by American forces experienced a particularly dramatic contrast in treatment. They went from conditions of deliberate extermination to conditions of deliberate care, from guards who viewed them as subhuman to American soldiers who treated them as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. This transition was psychologically difficult for men whose entire reality for years had been structured around survival in a system designed to kill them. Some couldn't process the change and remained convinced that American kindness was temporary or designed to extract something from them. Others grasped immediately that they were being saved and responded with overwhelming gratitude. Almost all were confused about why Americans would go to such effort to help Soviet prisoners, why American resources would be devoted to saving enemy nationals who had no obvious value to American interests. The concept of helping people because it was the right thing to do, because human suffering demanded response regardless of nationality or military allegiance, was simply foreign to their experience of how the world worked. American soldiers dealing with Soviet POWs also encountered the complicated reality that many of these prisoners didn't want to return to the Soviet Union. As Soviet prisoners spent time in American custody, as they were fed well, treated decently, and allowed to live without constant fear of violence or death, they began to understand what their futures would hold if they were repatriated. Stalin had made clear that Soviet soldiers who surrendered rather than fighting to death were traitors. Order number 227, issued in August 1941, stated that Soviet soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured were enemies of the people and that their families would be arrested. Throughout the war, Soviet soldiers who managed to escape German captivity and return to Soviet lines were often sent directly to punishment battalions or shot as deserters and traitors. The few who were allowed to return to regular units lived under suspicion and surveillance. Soviet authorities viewed anyone who had been in enemy hands as potentially compromised, possibly a spy, certainly unreliable. Soviet POWs in American custody knew this, understood that returning to the Soviet Union meant at minimum years in the Gulag labor camp system and quite possibly execution. The problem became acute as the war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens were in Western Allied custody, including former POWs liberated from German camps, soldiers who had been pressed into German service and then captured by Western forces, and civilians who had been taken to Germany as forced laborers and were now displaced persons. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 had included agreements about repatriation, with Stalin insisting that all Soviet citizens found in Western zones must be returned to Soviet control, and Western Allied leaders agreeing to this demand. American and British authorities initially viewed this as a reasonable humanitarian measure, assuming that people would want to return to their home country after the war. What Western authorities didn't fully understand, or chose not to acknowledge, was that many Soviet citizens preferred to remain in the West rather than return to face Stalin's suspicion and punishment. As the reality of forced repatriation began to be implemented in the summer and fall of 1945, American soldiers found themselves facing one of the most morally troubling assignments of their military careers. Soviet POWs who had been in American custody for months, who had been treated well, who had come to trust American fairness, were informed they would be returned to Soviet control. The reactions were immediate and desperate. Some Soviet prisoners begged American guards not to send them back, explaining through interpreters that they would be executed or sent to labor camps. Others offered to work as laborers, to do anything necessary if Americans would just allow them to remain in the West. Still others became silent and resigned, understanding that their fate was sealed and that nothing they could say would change it. A few attempted suicide, preferring death by their own hand to whatever awaited them in the Soviet Union. American soldiers processing Soviet POWs for repatriation were often devastated by what they were being ordered to do. One American captain, responsible for a POW camp holding several hundred Soviet prisoners, wrote letters describing the repatriation process as the worst experience of his military service, worse than combat, because he was being forced to send men to their deaths and he knew it. The Soviet prisoners had committed no crimes against Americans, had caused no problems in custody, had in many cases expressed admiration and gratitude for American treatment. Now they were being loaded onto trains and trucks, many of them in tears, to be handed over to Soviet authorities who viewed them as traitors. The American captain wrote that his men, tough combat veterans who had fought across Europe, were emotionally destroyed by having to force Soviet POWs onto transport vehicles while the prisoners begged for mercy that the Americans were not authorized to provide. The actual handover of Soviet prisoners to Soviet authorities at designated transfer points became scenes of tragedy that haunted the Western soldiers who witnessed them. Soviet NKVD officers, Stalin's secret police, received the returned prisoners with open contempt and hostility. The Soviet citizens being returned were treated as criminals from the moment Soviet authorities took custody. They were stripped of any possessions they had accumulated in Western custody, were verbally abused, were sometimes beaten immediately in view of the Western soldiers who had brought them. American and British soldiers watching these handovers understood they were witnessing the beginning of processes that would end with many of these people dead. Some Western soldiers wrote in letters and diaries that they felt complicit in murder, that following orders to repatriate Soviet citizens violated every principle they thought they were fighting for. The moral injury from participating in forced repatriation affected some American and British soldiers for the rest of their lives. The case of the Vlasov Army illustrated the tragedy of forced repatriation in particularly stark terms. Andrei Vlasov was a Soviet general who had been captured by Germans in 1942 and who, after his capture, formed the Russian Liberation Army, consisting of Soviet POWs and defectors who fought against Stalin's regime alongside German forces. Vlasov and his followers were motivated by genuine opposition to communism, believing they were fighting to liberate Russia from Stalin's tyranny. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of Soviet citizens served in Vlasov's forces. When Germany collapsed, elements of the Vlasov army attempted to surrender to American forces rather than to Soviet forces, hoping that Americans would protect them from Stalin's revenge. Some American commanders, moved by the desperation of Vlasov's soldiers and aware of what would happen if they were returned to Soviet control, initially tried to find ways to avoid immediate repatriation. But the Yalta agreements were clear. and American military and political leadership determined that all Soviet citizens must be returned regardless of their circumstances or their wishes. General Vlasov and his senior officers were handed over to Soviet authorities in May 1945. They were taken to Moscow, subjected to show trials, and executed in August 1946. The soldiers of the Russian Liberation Army who were repatriated faced various fates, but almost all involved either execution or lengthy sentences in the Gulag system. Some Western observers who studied the post-war fates of repatriated Soviet citizens estimated that roughly 1 in 5 were executed outright, while most of the survivors spent years in labor camps under brutal conditions that killed many of them. The Western Allies had essentially delivered hundreds of thousands of people to imprisonment or death, and they had done so in the name of honoring agreements with Stalin that Stalin himself was violating in numerous ways regarding Eastern Europe. The experience of individual Soviet POWs who went through American captivity and then were repatriated illustrated both the kindness of American treatment and the tragedy of forced return. One Soviet soldier named Ivan Kovalev, captured in early 1945, spent 3 months in American custody in Germany. He later wrote a memoir, published decades after Stalin's death, when it became safer to write honestly about such experiences, describing his time in American hands. Kovalev recalled being terrified when first captured, expecting torture and execution based on what Soviet commissars had told him. Instead, American soldiers treated his wounds, gave him food, and sent him to a POW camp where conditions were better than anything he had experienced in 4 years of military service. He described receiving 3 meals daily, having access to medical care, being allowed to write letters home, and being treated by American guards with basic respect. Kovalev wrote that he and other Soviet prisoners talked among themselves about how everything their government had told them about Americans was false, how Soviet propaganda had been lies designed to control them. When informed he would be repatriated, Kovalev begged American authorities to allow him to remain in the West. He explained that as a former POW, he would be considered a traitor, that he would face either execution or the Gulag. American officers to whom he made this plea were sympathetic but explained that they had no authority to grant his request, that all Soviet citizens must be returned under the agreements their governments had made. Kovalev was forced onto a train with other Soviet repatriates in August 1945. He described the journey back to Soviet control as a descent into hell, with the good treatment by Americans seeming like a dream from which he was waking to Soviet reality. Upon arrival in Soviet territory, Kovalev and others were immediately arrested by NKVD officers and charged with treason for having surrendered. Kovalev spent the next 10 years in labor camps in Siberia, surviving through luck and endurance. He wrote that of the approximately 200 Soviet POWs who had been in his section of American camps and who were repatriated together, fewer than 30 survived their first 5 years back in Soviet control. Many were executed. Others died from the brutal conditions in the camps. A few, like Kovalev, survived and eventually were released after Stalin's death when policies toward former POWs softened slightly. The women and children caught up in repatriation were particularly tragic cases. Soviet women who had been taken to Germany as forced laborers, who had survived horrific conditions in German factories and farms, were liberated by Western forces and initially relieved to have survived the war. Many of these women had young children born during captivity, either from consensual relationships or from rape. American forces provided these women and children with food, shelter, and medical care while trying to determine their fates. When it became clear that Soviet women and children would also be forcibly repatriated, many became desperate. They knew that Soviet authorities would view them as compromised by their time in German hands, that women who had been in German territory were assumed to be collaborators, or worse. Some Soviet women begged American soldiers to allow them to remain in displaced persons camps rather than being sent back. A few American camp commanders, horrified by what they were being ordered to do, delayed repatriation of women and children as long as possible, hoping policies would change. Eventually, most were forced to comply with orders, and Soviet women and children were returned to face Stalin's justice, which was harsh and unforgiving toward anyone who had been in enemy hands regardless of circumstances. The contrast between American abundance and Soviet deprivation became a recurring theme in accounts from Soviet POWs who experienced American captivity. Soviet soldiers came from a society where shortages were constant, where even basic consumer goods were scarce, where the population had endured collectivization, purges, and war that had killed millions and impoverished millions more. Ordinary Soviet citizens lived with material conditions that would have been considered unacceptable poverty in America. Soviet soldiers' rations were inadequate, both in quantity and quality. Their uniforms and equipment were often shoddy. Their medical care was minimal. When these men experienced American POW camps where food was abundant, where clothing and equipment were of good quality, where medicine was available and used generously, they encountered a material reality that contradicted everything Soviet propaganda had told them about capitalist poverty and socialist superiority. Some Soviet POWs wrote in letters or diaries that they realized for the first time that their government had lied to them, that conditions in capitalist America were obviously better than in communist Soviet Union, and that this realization was dangerous knowledge that they would have to hide if they returned home. American soldiers interacting with Soviet POWs were often struck by the prisoners' reactions to ordinary American abundance. One American private stationed at a POW processing center described giving Soviet prisoners Red Cross packages that included cigarettes, candy, soap, and small toiletries. The Soviet prisoners treated these items as treasure, carefully saving them, unwilling to use them because they seemed too valuable to consume. The American soldier couldn't understand this reaction until an interpreter explained that Soviet soldiers never received such items, that soap and candy were luxury goods in the Soviet Union that ordinary people rarely accessed. The American private wrote home to his family that he felt guilty about how much Americans had compared to these Russian prisoners, but also grateful to be American because the contrast in living standards was so dramatic. This theme appeared in many American soldiers' accounts of dealing with Soviet POWs. Recognition that material abundance Americans took for granted represented unimaginable luxury to people from the Soviet Union. The few Soviet citizens who managed to avoid forced repatriation faced difficult futures, but at least survived. Some succeeded in concealing their Soviet citizenship, claiming to be from other Eastern European countries that were not subject to the same absolute repatriation requirements. A Soviet POW who could convince American authorities he was actually Polish or Czech, or from one of the Baltic states, might be allowed to remain in displaced persons camps, rather than being repatriated. This required falsifying documents, learning to speak convincingly about regions the person had never lived in, and maintaining the deception through multiple interviews. A few succeeded, others found protection through marriage to Western citizens or through sponsorship by religious organizations that helped them immigrate to Western countries. But these were rare exceptions. The vast majority of Soviet citizens in Western custody were repatriated, and most faced severe consequences for having been in Western hands. The policy of forced repatriation was controversial even at the time among some Western officials and military officers who understood what they were doing. British and American officers who dealt directly with Soviet repatriates wrote reports questioning the morality and wisdom of the policy. They argued that forcing people to return to a country where they would face persecution violated Western principles of human rights and refugee protection. They noted that forced repatriation was creating resentment among Soviet citizens who had initially been grateful for Western liberation. They warned that the scenes of desperate people being forced onto trains while begging for mercy would haunt Western soldiers and create lasting moral problems. Some politicians and journalists in Western countries raised concerns about the policy, arguing that the Yalta agreements were being interpreted too literally and that humanitarian considerations should take precedence over diplomatic convenience. But these objections were overruled by officials who prioritized maintaining good relations with Stalin and who feared that refusing to repatriate Soviet citizens would jeopardize cooperation on other post-war issues. The full scale of the tragedy only became clear years later when information about the fates of repatriated Soviet citizens emerged. Researchers using Soviet archives that opened after the Soviet Union's collapse documented that hundreds of thousands of repatriated Soviet citizens were executed, sent to Gulag camps, or exiled to remote regions. The NKVD maintained detailed records of returned POWs and civilians, tracking their locations and fates. These records showed systematic persecution of people whose only crime was having been in German or Western hands during the war. Stalin's paranoia about Western influence and his determination to eliminate anyone who might have been compromised by exposure to the West meant that repatriated Soviet citizens were treated as threats to be neutralized. The Western allies who had forced repatriation had known it would be bad, but the documentary evidence showed it was worse than even pessimistic observers had predicted. The moral reckoning with forced repatriation continued for decades after the war. Veterans who had participated in repatriating Soviet citizens wrote memoirs expressing regret and shame about what they had been ordered to do. Historians debated whether Western leaders had been naive about Stalin's intentions, or whether they had simply decided that Soviet citizens' lives were acceptable sacrifices to maintain the wartime alliance. Holocaust survivors and human rights advocates pointed to forced repatriation as an example of how even democratic nations could commit moral atrocities when political expediency was prioritized over human rights. The term Operation Keelhaul, used to describe the forced repatriation program, became shorthand for betrayal and moral failure, a reminder that victory in World War II had included actions that Western nations later recognized as deeply shameful. For the Soviet citizens who survived repatriation and lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse in 1991, there was bitter vindication in the knowledge that history had proven their fears justified. The Soviet system that had branded them traitors for the crime of surviving German captivity or being in Western hands had itself collapsed, revealed as fundamentally rotten and unsustainable. Some survivors wrote or spoke about their experiences, contributing to historical understanding of this chapter of the war. Others remained silent, the trauma too deep to revisit even after it was safe to speak. Almost all expressed the view that Western treatment of Soviet POWs had been humane and decent, that Americans and British had shown them kindness and respect, but that the decision to force repatriation, despite knowing the consequences, represented a betrayal that marred the Western victory over fascism. The legacy of how Americans treated Soviet POWs during the war, setting aside the tragedy of forced repatriation, remained a testament to American values about human dignity and the proper conduct of warfare. The field kitchens serving hot meals to prisoners, the medical care provided to wounded enemies, the basic respect shown to Soviet POWs in American custody. These reflected a military culture that maintained ethical standards even in wartime. Soviet prisoners who experienced this treatment and survived to remember it recognized that Americans had shown them humanity their own government denied them. One survivor interviewed in the 1990s asked what he remembered most about American captivity, said it was the kindness of American soldiers who treated him like a human being rather than like an animal or a traitor. He said that experience taught him that political systems matter, that the contrast between American treatment and Soviet treatment of prisoners revealed fundamental differences between societies that respected human dignity and societies that didn't. The story of Soviet POWs discovering that American captivity meant hot meals rather than execution, medical care rather than torture, and decent treatment rather than cruelty, represents both the best and worst of how the Western Allies conducted themselves during and after World War II. The treatment of prisoners reflected American values at their finest, demonstrating that even enemies deserved dignity and care. The forced repatriation reflected the cold political calculations of leaders who sacrificed vulnerable people to maintain relationships with a dictator they knew was evil. Soviet soldiers who had been taught that Americans were monsters learned through direct experience that Soviet propaganda was lies, that Americans were decent people who treated prisoners humanely. That lesson was powerful enough that many Soviet POWs preferred any fate, including death, over returning to face Stalin's vengeance for having learned the truth about how different the West was from what Soviet propaganda claimed. The tragedy was that most of them had no choice, that Western leaders made decisions that sent hundreds of thousands of people back to imprisonment, exile, or death in the name of political expedience. The hot meals served by American field kitchens to Soviet prisoners were real. The medical care, the decent treatment, the respect for human dignity, All of that was authentic and reflected American values. But it couldn't save Soviet citizens from the consequences of decisions made by leaders who prioritized diplomacy over humanity. That failure, that betrayal of people who had trusted Western decency, remained a stain on the Allied victory, even as the treatment of prisoners in American custody remained a credit to American values and the soldiers who upheld them.